Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 70. And today I'm joined by Nick Cosentino to chat about refactoring. So welcome to the show, Nick.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's awesome to be here. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I'm not sure how this is going to go because we're talking about refactoring and that's quite a broad conversation. So I think this will be quite an interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think you're totally right. Like anytime I talk about refactoring, it seems like there's this nice battle between that's not refactoring, that's rewriting, that's, label it something else. And what I plan to talk about today is like how that is sort of a spectrum, if you will, and different people will label it differently, but the end goal is that you're making changes to code and trying to maintain functionality, but to get to a different desired end state. So yeah, just different labels, I guess.
Yeah, and hopefully making things better as you go along as well.
Exactly. That's like ultimately you're doing it to get something better and not just because we didn't have other work to do and we're just going to rewrite code for fun.
Well, it is more fun than doing real work, isn't it? So,
Honestly, I feel like for a lot of, and maybe this is too much of a generalization, but I feel like for a lot of programmers, it is, right? Like it's almost like you can get your head right into the code. You can kind of step back from maybe like real requirements for a moment and say, like, if I wanted to just think about like building Lego blocks that are virtual and I could structure everything perfectly, then you have this opportunity to go do that with code. So I do feel like for a lot of people, it probably is like more fun.
Yeah, I definitely quite enjoy it. But before we're jumping into refactoring, and we've not even introduced you. So you're the principal software engineering manager at Microsoft, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And also a fellow Dome Train author.
I am.
And do tons of other stuff too. In fact, to be honest, you're probably better at describing you than me. So
sure.
Could you give the listeners a quick intro into yourself and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. I can give you a little background. So Nick Cosentino, I am a principal software engineering manager at Microsoft. I work in the Substrate side of Microsoft. So for folks that don't know what that is, if you think about Microsoft 365, the Office 365 products, Substrate is sort of the platform and infrastructure that allows the services to be built with a common ground, if you will. So if you think about hundreds of microservices that might be running, instead of every service saying, hey, like, how do we go build auth? How do we go build search functionality? It's like Substrate is going to be that core infrastructure that these other service teams can use. So to back up a little bit, because most of my experience is not at Microsoft, I did work at a startup before Microsoft. It was called Magnet Forensics. That's where most of my professional development was. But I started off there almost a few months in. I became an engineering manager. So kind of fresh out of university, kind of a weird situation to be managing engineering teams. But I was developing software and managing engineering teams at this forensic company. And that was all .NET, all desktop development. So very interesting experience. The domain of digital forensics is very cool and exciting. Very impactful mission. So we were doing a lot of work to help investigators and law enforcement. Very impactful to know that you're helping make a difference in that way. So I really went from doing desktop development all the way over to these like very large distributed systems. So the common thing was Microsoft tech. The uncommon thing was literally everything else. So I did manage deployment teams in Microsoft for the first 3 years that I've been here. And that's pretty challenging space because we had like some monolithic deployments and also owned the deployments for hundreds of other microservices. So just some different deployment patterns there. And at the beginning of this year, so it's been probably 6 to 7 months now, I've been moved over to the routing plane. So I focus on DDoS protection, big distributed caching systems and things like that. So same area, but different focus.
Yeah, so you were definitely better at explaining that than me. I couldn't have done that. That's quite interesting going from like the law enforcement side that you mentioned to helping with Microsoft Office. That's quite a big shift. But as you say, I guess it's all Microsoft tech, so it's just continuing on with like the same ways of developing, I guess. You're not involved with Teams at all, are you?
No, I'm not.
Oh, good, because otherwise we'd have to end this interview very, very quickly.
That's why I was hesitating to say anything. Technically, no, I don't do any feature development for teams. And personally, I don't develop anything. I'm just managing teams that do. But we have routing technology that can help support teams as needed. So no, I won't. I'm not going to take any responsibility for any teams issues. But
I was only joking. It made me laugh because there's a comic which I'll put in the show notes. It always cracks me up. But it's this large meeting his girlfriend's dad for the first time, and they first go into the house and shaking hands, and he goes, "Oh, I believe you work at Microsoft." And the lad goes, "Yes, I'm the lead developer of Teams." And the dad goes, "You have exactly 10 seconds to get the beep out of my house." And it's just so funny. But I didn't do it justice explaining it there, but I'll put it in the show notes. It's just so funny. If you're not fond of colourful language, then maybe don't look at the link.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Yeah. So Microsoft is I've been in the Microsoft ecosystem for a long time. And as you mentioned, I have created some courses on Dome Train, which has been an awesome experience. And then I think the one other thing I just mentioned is that I work at Microsoft, but on the side, I've been finding it very rewarding to be sharing about software engineering concepts and just trying to help other people. I think prior to Microsoft, I had this big sense of fulfillment for the work I was doing, just the mission I was very much aligned with. And I'm not saying that I'm not interested in what I'm doing at Microsoft. It is very interesting, especially the technology and the scale is just wild. But I think from a personal sense of fulfillment, having some time outside of work to be able to help people, that's a piece that I feel is missing a little bit in my direct everyday work, especially being on a platform team now versus literally having law enforcement come in and talk to our teams and stuff like that. There's just this level of separation. So, yeah.
So before we properly jump into refactoring, though, a quick reminder to the listeners that this podcast has its own Discord community. If you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see a Discord link there. And also a thank you to Everstack for sponsoring the podcast. Everstack is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And lastly, speaking of sponsors, the show is currently looking for additional sponsors. If you're interested, the details are on the website. Right, so refactoring. So this means move all your stuff to Kubernetes, right?
That's right, yeah, and everything microservices Kubernetes, and then you just wash your hands and walk away, and it's all done.
Cool. Well, it was great having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan.
Listeners. Seriously though, you mentioned earlier that refactoring means different things to different people.
That's right.
So what does it actually mean to you? What is refactoring?
Sure, yeah, and so from my perspective, when I talk about refactoring, I take a more sort of broad definition. So if I jump to what I believe most people will say pure refactoring is, it's a much more narrow definition. And the reason that I don't like using it is that I don't think that most people in practice adhere to it. So starting with the narrow definition, it would be being able to change code without changing the behavior of the code. So the most simple, trivial example is just renaming parameters or variables, right? You have refactored it. The goal to improve the code was maybe to increase readability or something like that. But functionally, the behavior of that code is identical, unless you have some weird nuanced behavior where the name of your variable or something is going to break something. That behavior would remain the same. So when we start extrapolating that to different types of refactoring, you could say, okay, well, you might do a method extraction, right? And you're just pulling code. It's the same code. You move it to another method. That behavior should be, in theory, identical. So when we take this very narrow lens of refactoring that way, where behavior does not change at all, in my opinion, that actually limits a lot of the different things that you can do with refactoring. And I think from a theoretical perspective, it's pretty easy to talk through, right? Just talk about the different changes you can make where literally there's no behavioral changes. But I think in practice that falls apart because most things in software development, if you just take the theoretical lens and apply it, it just doesn't really hold. Different ways that you might go say, we're going to use this architecture, these design patterns. You're using, theoretical information about it, some of the computer science perspectives, but in practice, we have different constraints, different things to look at. And all of a sudden, you start chipping away at the validity or the assumptions that these things hold. And I find the same thing with refactoring. So you might say, okay, well, yeah, we're trying to keep the behavior the same, but we're also doing this other little thing on the side. And now all of a sudden, slightly different behavior. But you needed to do it because the whole reason you were refactoring in the first place was to enable some new functionality. So I just find that in general, the definition kind of bleeds over to have some amount of, I'm going to use air quotes here, but some amount of rewriting. But I think the danger is when we say rewriting, people jump to this very broad, heavy-handed rewrite where if you say the word rewrite, it means literally scrap the entire system. You're starting from scratch, you're rewriting. And that's the other extreme. So I like talking about refactoring in a way that I feel is the more practical definition, which is ideally not changing too much behavior, but you're probably touching something that's going to alter the behavior at least a little bit.
Yeah, I guess you kind of have the different types of refactoring as well. It's when you're what's the right word? I don't want to say Boy Scout rule because that's not very inclusive, but what's another word we can use?
Like leave it better than you found it kind of approach. Like
good citizen principle, I guess. That's one I've heard quite a few. But there's that. So you're working on a feature and you're just, leaving it better than you found it and making changes. But then there's also, if you've got a code base that isn't very readable and can be improved and you want to improve it, and maybe you've got an explicit, I don't know whether, would you call it a tech debt task where it's just about the refactoring and making it more readable? And then I guess you're more likely to be able to do that without changing behavior because the whole point of that task is to make it more readable and do the refactoring without also making, I suppose, user story changes.
That's right. Yeah. So like I see this get talked a lot about on LinkedIn in particular. I see a lot of opinions on like the good citizen principle, like leave it better than you found it. And like I'm on the fence about it, and not because I don't like the principle behind it. I think it's awesome. Like like why would you look at something bad and say I'm just going to leave it that way? So I like the idea of saying, hey, we're in the code. I noticed something that's not good. Like let me go do something better with it. But I come back to like in practice, right? So. And I should preface this too. When I talk about things in practice, I'm just saying from my experience, this is what I've observed, and not that we can't do some effort here to make it better. So what I have observed is like when we do this good citizen principle, let's take a quick example. You're building a feature, you have to go extend some class or, touch some code that exists already. And you find yourself in this position where you go, oh, like this variable name kind of sucks, or like it's a little bit unreadable because this logic, maybe this method's like 500 lines long. Like I'm here. I should do something about it because I'm building on top of it. What I have found happen in practice, and I'm not saying like anyone who's listening, they might say, well, Nick, that's not the right way to do it. I'm saying like I probably agree with you, but this is what I observe in practice is that a lot of the time what will happen is someone will say, well, I'm just being a good citizen. I'm going to continue building my feature, but I'm going to refactor this. And then they put the commit together. And this is a key point that I want to call out because what happens is they go to deliver their feature or a bug fix even, and inevitably, oh, there's something wrong. We have to back it out. And it's not every feature, right? It's not every feature you commit or every bug fix you commit. It's like, oh, it's bad, get it out. But something goes wrong. And this will happen because we're all human. And now all of a sudden you back out not only the feature, but the refactor, or the other way. You end up having a bug in the refactor. You thought it wasn't touching the behavior, but there were some test cases that happened to not exist, whatever. So now, because you coupled your refactoring with your feature or bug fix, you're now backing that out because you were just trying to be a good person. So one easy, I should use air quotes again, one easy thing that you can try to do is if you're going to do these things at the same time, just do separate commits for them. And like a quick, like check the box like that you just avoided that entire problem. So that's one example.
Yeah, I think another thing which is what I thought you were going to say then is if someone's reviewing your PR, then if you've got like say you've done a control RR in Rider or whatever, and it's renamed a whole bunch of stuff because you chose a better name. But if they're reviewing that PR and you've got all this noise of 100 files have changed and all this kind of thing, then it's really hard to see the wood for the tree. It's really hard to see actually what's going on, what's the feature change that you made if that's all the same commit. Where actually if you do them separate commits, even if it's in the same PR, at least you can look at them separately, or even better, just do that control RR, do a PR, which is about that refactor, and then continue what you're doing so that your PR for your actual user story is much more readable, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we extrapolate that scenario, and this is why I said that in my experience, I've seen a lot more closer to rewrites of feature areas than pure refactoring, is that this type of thing happens where someone goes, I'm building this feature, and in general, code bases that live for a long time aren't perfectly modular and extensible. There's going to be things, a little bit of crap that's sprinkled around. It just happens. So you start going, okay, I have to touch this area. I'm going to clean this up a little bit and include it in the PR. And now I'm going to the next part, and oh, there's another thing. I'm going to clean this up, include it in the PR. And what ends up happening is that you keep going further and further down the rabbit hole. And again, if you take the same principle of just making it more modular, so instead of saying, I'm just going to keep tacking all this stuff into my one big commit, one big pull request, just kind of like pause your development and say, this is a thing I should clean up. Let me take a snapshot, commit it, get it reviewed, push it through, and then keep moving. I think that's like a quick, easy way to just avoid a lot of these problems that turn what I would call like this good citizen principle from keeping it to truly being helpful versus accidentally causing all of these problems.
Yeah, and I guess, and this is probably a topic we'll also talk about with testing, but if you have got quite good test coverage, then you're hopefully more confident that you can make those refactors, get it in a PR, get it over to main, and then you can carry on your work. And you've got that safety net of those tests as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And like one of the other things I love to talk about is testing. And for that exact reason, right? I always say like testing is, you can label it and define it however you want, but my definition ends up being like, it's just going to be the thing that's building confidence for you. So when people start diving into testing and saying, well, okay, like integration tests are the only way, or unit tests are the only way, or I'm just like, I don't think there's one only way. It's like whatever is going to give you truly confidence in making changes. And that might vary completely from project to project or feature area to feature area. But especially with refactoring, if you're thinking about say unit tests that mock a lot of stuff, if that's all you have and you go to change the body of this code, you might find that those types of tests, they might be brittle in that sense, maybe depending on how they're written. So you have to think about the type of refactoring you're doing, the types of test coverage you have, and then think, do I have enough confidence that like I can just go make this? And if not, it might be a good opportunity to pause even that refactoring and say, let me go put the tests in place. But to kind of go back to this rabbit hole analogy, one of the other reasons from this like good citizen approach that makes me a little bit nervous to just have, especially more senior developers, just recommend that blindly to people, is that it can completely derail deliverables. And in a ridiculous amount. And I don't think that some people realize this, because if they haven't worked in smaller companies where like getting features out can like literally keep your company alive, they go, well, hey, you're making the code better. We can pause and we can refactor it. And then we can pause to go add the tests. And like, those are all very good things. But when you have a business that's trying to stay alive, sometimes doing those things at that point in time is truly not a good decision for the business. It's really hard for some people to hear that, I think, because they're going, what do you mean having better code and better test coverage is not a good decision? And then I would say, well, if the company's not going to exist next week, like what was the point of the tests?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why, especially if people become, well, all developers really, but especially as become more senior, understanding the business is so important, because you need to have that balance of what is right for the business versus, yes, let's have some fun and write some new code and stuff. But yeah, like going back to what you're saying about the different types of tests and people saying there's only one way. If anyone says there's only one way about anything, then stop listening right there. Unless it's Kubernetes, of course.
That's right, yeah. You need microservices and Kubernetes. My joke for that is like, yeah, it's the programming language analogy, right? Like every programming language is just a tool. There's no best except C#. So there you go.
Well, you're in good company with that opinion, so that's fine.
Yeah. Safe place, yeah.
Talk about refactoring, I guess we can't really not talk about legacy code. And that kind of ties in nicely with testing, because I can't remember who said this. It was one of the famous people, not Uncle Bob, so someone like that. Oh, no, was it Michael Feathers, I think? I can't remember who, but someone said the definition of legacy code is it's not got tests. And I'll find it and link in the show notes to whoever it was that said that. But yeah, I agree, because if you don't have tests, how do you know it works? Every change you make, how do you know you've not broken something? It's kind of...
I recently had a conversation with an employee where we were talking about something that had gone wrong in production despite someone actually going through and validating things. So like, no, they did all the right things from our perspective, right? It wasn't like they just forgot. It was like, hey, I actually went through these steps and tried to validate, and we still had an escape, which is fine, right? We're human. It's going to happen. There's going to be scenarios like this. But when I was talking with him about this, I said, I have almost like a philosophy that's going to sound kind of ridiculous on the surface, but I think it frames how I think about testing. And that's, if you're building a tool, you're delivering a feature, or you have a bug fix, if you push that through and it's landed in production, I say, assume that it's broken immediately. And that's where it sounds kind of ridiculous, because you would say, well, Nick, if I literally just built it and I just ran the thing, like how could it possibly be broken immediately? Sort of the next obvious question is, well, prove to me that it works. And if you go, okay, well, let me go run this thing, like let me go run the feature, let me exercise the user interface, or let me go call these APIs to this service, I would pause you and say, okay, so are you expecting that every single other developer on the team, anytime they're making a code change to make sure they didn't break your thing that you did, they should go do this? Because if the answer is yes, then I would say, like, can you see how that doesn't scale very well? So it's kind of an exaggerated perspective, but the whole point of it is to say, like, if you're not putting tests in place to validate the things that you have, and I don't mean maybe the initial validation, because some people will say, hey, for some reason, we need to test in production because we don't have infrastructure for it. It's not about the validation, it's about the regression coverage. So if you don't have regression coverage in place, I would tell people, like, you must assume that the thing that you did is always broken, because you don't have anything else that tells you that. And that ends up being like a framing, like a philosophical framing for me to say, okay, like, would I care if this thing was broken tomorrow? Because maybe I don't. Maybe it's like I can quickly diagnose it. It's not a critical thing. I can move past it. But if it's mission critical and I can't assume that it's going to be working, then we need tests or something around it. So that's kind of a little perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. With if code changes, and one interesting thing have you heard of mutation testing?
Yes, I've heard there's, like, especially for, I think .NET has, like, Striker is like a library for it. I haven't extensively used it myself.
Yeah, we had back in episode 18, Stephen Poltz on talking about it. And basically, I won't go too much into it, but the concept is the library in memory changes lines of your code. And the goal is that at least one of your tests should fail because it's changed. It might change, like, it'll find if statements, and it might change a greater than to a less than or something, or change an equals to a not equals, or remove a line of code. And for each of these changes, it's expected that a test will fail, because if it doesn't, it means you've not got tests covering that. And it's just quite an interesting, I said afterwards I would start trying to use it, but to be honest, I didn't. But yeah, it feels like one of these ones where you've got to be using it from the start of a project. Otherwise, you're just going to get so many things. But yeah, it's quite an interesting concept.
Yeah, it would feel very difficult to try and catch up, right? If you were like, I'm going to turn this on, and it's like, by the way, you have like 7 million tests you have to go, right? But the concept, I think, is spot on, right? In this conversation that I was having with the employee, I was saying, like, one of the goals of framing things that way is that I would want, ideally, anyone to be able to come in and touch the code that I was working on. So it means that you could literally have a different person from a different team say, I'm going to help you guys out building this thing. I'm not talking about the architectural direction necessarily, but if they could just come in and make a fix or tweak a feature or something, they should know, and you should have confidence that they're not going to break anything. Like, there should be tests in place that say anyone who needs to can come in and touch this, and I feel comfortable that it's going to be okay.
Yeah, I guess there is. I'm just thinking about like real projects I've worked on, and I totally agree with that. But I think there's still that huge, as in, if you've got a user story and you want to get it out there and show you being productive and you've done the feature really quickly and stuff, and then it's going to add a whole bunch more time to write a whole bunch of tests. And it does. It's kind of, you can say that tests speed you up, and it speeds you up over the long term because your code base is more bug free. But as far as that, the scope of that user story, it certainly doesn't speed you up because that's going to take longer for the testing. So you can see where it's almost too tempting to, I'll just skip these tests, a few of these tests because I just want to get this out. And you can see that. So you can certainly see why code bases, they're not all like 100% code coverage and all that kind of thing. So it's kind of, it definitely takes a lot of willpower, I think.
Yeah, and like that conversation around having, like, you know, it's not done until there's tests and stuff like that. Like, yeah, like in reality, there's going to be shortcuts taken periodically, even if you're doing your best effort, even if you're doing TDD and, you know, trying to think about writing tests first and putting in place tests first. There's just going to be scenarios and stuff that get missed. Like, as humans, it's going to happen. So over time, like, 'cause the longer a code base lives, there's going to be more of these opportunities where there's just gaps, and it's kind of how it goes. But yeah, I think it's an interesting point about, if we think about, tests speed things up. I think you said it very, very well, that like over the long term, they will. If you think about, literally, I have to write lines of code, just in that sense, it will slow you down. Just by definition, you have to write more code. It's not that it's wrong, but like, probably, and I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests long term it will speed you up because you're not spending as much time like messing around to go fix stuff. So
I did actually have a conversation with Ian Cooper quite a while ago, literally on TDD. It was a few years back now, so I'm going to have to re-listen and to see what we actually talked about. But yeah, I think we digged quite into this. But going back to refactoring, I'm a huge fan of, like, well, when I was a Visual Studio user, I used ReSharper. Now I use Rider, but still the ReSharper engine. And just using all those all the shortcuts and functionality to actually really help with refactoring. I think that makes a huge difference. Is that one of the things, like I've not seen your course, but for your refactoring course, did you dig into the tooling as well and that kind of thing?
Yeah, a little bit for sure, but I think like I covered from the Visual Studio perspective, and I think that probably Rider and ReSharper just have certainly a different set of tools, but probably more. Like some of the tools in Visual Studio, like I use nonstop, are I think like F2 is renaming stuff, right? Like that, like I said, most trivial refactoring you can do is renaming stuff. So I use that nonstop. There's other things like people will disagree with this. It's just a sort of design philosophy. I use interfaces a lot just because that's how I like to program, because historically I wrote a lot of unit tests. Now that things like test containers and other tools make truly spinning up like databases and allowing us to run integration tests so much quicker, I find myself writing fewer unit tests. But I use interfaces a lot historically because going back to this point about tests are going to add more time. The more that I was falling into this spot of like, oh crap, I have to go write the tests and I might have to change the code to make it testable. I just found that because if I'm writing unit tests a lot, if I start putting in interfaces, I can at least have the option to mock things that I need to. Now, some people will say like it's overkill, like you're just making more files and more work for yourself, which is fine, but this is what I found works for me at least. So another tool in Visual Studio is just like being able to extract interface. So make my class and I go, this works how I want, extract the interface. Now when I go use that dependency in some other spot, I'm just dealing with the interface and I feel like I've decoupled the implementations at least. So like little things like this, and I don't say this to suggest that you must follow what I'm saying. I'm saying it to say like, these are the things that work for me. And I think that if you find how you want to write tests and your style of testing, the packages, whatever you're using, if you're thinking about when I go to write this test, what kind of how am I going to structure my code? Like you'll find these little tips for yourself along the way. And these just happen to be some of mine, like extracting interfaces, renaming things. And one of the other ones that's a super quick one is like parameter reorganizing. So ReSharper, I'm sure, has something like that. Visual Studio has that as well. And the nice thing about that is it's not just go to the method signature and you manually go swap it, and then you go to the 1,000 call sites and go swap those too manually. It does it for you, which is very nice. And yeah, just those are a couple off the top of my head.
Yeah, I quite like with the reordering thing. I think I do it without thinking about it, but I think it's Control-Shift-Alt and up and down, and you can take a method and just, like, as you press up and down, it moves it up, a method up, and you can jump methods around and reorder, so that's quite nice. But yeah, there's just lots of like little things like that. With the interfaces, I think you can like pull member up, and I think they use pull and push kind of terminology, where you actually, you can either pull it, like the hierarchy of inheritance, or whether it's an interface or an abstract class, and you can basically take a member and just pull it into the interface so it's got a signature in the interface.
Yeah, like pull up or push back down to but that concept.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's just loads. It's kind of, I know when I used to use Visual Studio and ReSharper, a good tip was to actually just look through the ReSharper. At the time, there was one menu. I don't know what it's like now. I'm not, because I use Rider, but by looking at the menu, the drop-down menu at the top of the IDE, and look at all the submenus, because they all had shortcuts next to them, you could actually explore ReSharper's functionality, all the refactoring stuff, and look at the hotkeys, learn them by just looking at that menu and the submenus and things. And that was quite a powerful way of like just learning like what ReSharper did. And I found that most people I worked with, air quotes, used ReSharper, but they just didn't use any of these features. So it was quite satisfying showing people what it can actually do.
Yeah, with tools like that, there's probably, well, not even probably, there is so much functionality built in from teams of people that are like, these are literally things developers will get value out of. And yeah, you're going to fall into your own pattern of what feels effective for you. And that's great. And like I encourage people to find the things that work for them. But if you go exploring a little bit, there's going to be these things like you were saying, where it's like, I didn't even know that existed. And you might be doing something similar, but by hand. And there's just a one click thing, one keyboard shortcut thing that just does it for you. And suddenly a task, that was taking you even a couple minutes, whatever, doesn't seem that bad. But you do it like you're developing for years and years, and you do it frequently. Like that's just going to save time overall. So little things like that go a long way.
Yeah, definitely. Are there some things in code bases that really stand out? Nested ifs and loops and things like that scream out to you when you see it. This needs refactoring.
Sure. Yeah, there's and I don't know the best way to kind of navigate answering this because I think there's a bunch of things and the severity of them is different. The obviousness of them is different. So, a couple obvious ones that maybe aren't severe. Certainly, like it's going to sound kind of funny, especially because this is all audio and you kind of need to visualize this. But if you're thinking about nested ifs and even ifs with loops and stuff, just thinking about the shape of your code and how indented it's getting, to me, it's not to say that it's wrong, but it's an indicator that there might be an opportunity here to rejig some things because especially for newer developers, it might not seem obvious, but there is a big tax on your brain in trying to like read code that is more and more indented. That's not to say that you want to have like a 2-character width of all your code or something ridiculous, but having more vertical code keeps your eyes from trying to scan left to right. And it seems like such a trivial thing. It's like, I know how to read code, whatever, like I can see it all on my screen, but the more indented it is and the more like tax your brain has to try and align where things are. So I would encourage people, like if you're like, I don't care about this, it seems like such a small detail, try it. Like give it a shot and see that if over a period of time it's improving things. But I think from a readability perspective, something that stands out that's obvious, maybe not the most critical, is sort of that shape of the code with indentation. So that's probably one thing right off the top of my head.
So if your braces look like a greater than sign, that's not a good sign.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like narrowing down to one thing.
Exactly.
And I think so an interesting thing that's come up when I've talked to people about this, because again, it seems like such a small topic or whatever, but I feel like a lot of people went through school or some other type of, whether it's boot camp or whatever, their learning process, somewhere along the line, someone said, methods can only have one return. And they took that and they said, this is how code works. You can have one return. Does the code allow more than one return? Sure, but we're not supposed to. And I'm not telling people that like it's wrong. You can have your own opinions about this, but when you only have one return, I find that it almost forces you to have more indentation with your conditionals. And for me personally, once I got around the idea of like, I like returning early because if I'm reading code and I'm thinking about the execution of code, if I can have a condition that breaks me out early, I don't even have to think about anything else that's after. When you have one return and you have a scenario where you're like, hey, nothing else should run here, the key word I said was should. You have to go read the rest of the code to make sure that nothing else is running. But an early return can really save you indentation, so that tax on your readability. And in my opinion, the complexity is reduced because you don't have to verify everything else after the return for that scenario.
Yeah, I guess once your functions start getting like that, it's also a time where you might be thinking about splitting the function out into smaller private methods where the name tells you what that block of code is doing. Yeah, and again, going back to the tooling, this tooling, you can select a chunk of code inside a method, say extract it, and it intelligently works out what methods that new function should have and what parameters that new function should have.
Yeah, it's super powerful.
You wonder with like, all this refactoring tools that can do a lot of these things for you, like we're just talking about, what AI is going to do for refactoring.
Yeah, and it's interesting because right now, for folks that are using like Copilot or other similar tools, it's like a more advanced autocomplete. Basically, like I'm finding now because Copilot is working with my code bases, there's similar like types of things that I'm writing. Like people might be upset, but I don't use Entity Framework Core. Not because I hate it, just like it's not how my brain works. So I use Dapper and DB-up for my development. Someday I will be on the EF Core team using it, but today's not that day. So I write my own repositories. I like having my SQL written out, but it's a very common pattern, right? Which is probably an indicator Entity Framework Core would be good here. But the AI tools like Copilot, they're very good at predicting what I want to write next. So I find it fascinating that if it's able to start predicting what I want to write next, I just don't know the right interface for the code. Like it feels a little bit awkward to me to like some of the commands, or like I guess it kind of works, but it just feels a little clunky currently. I think it's like / in Visual Studio for Copilot will let you type to Copilot and say like, hey, like Copilot, refactor this code. That process feels clunky to me only because it pops up another screen. It has a bit of a delay, whereas the autocomplete part is very much like it's almost like doing it before my brain even thinks about what I want. So honestly, I think it's very close to being at this point where I can just literally type to Copilot and it will be doing that refactoring that I want. So just it's not quite there, but very soon, I think.
I just find it amazing. If imagine 5 years ago, past us, if we could show past us what like Copilot, ChatGPT, all this kind of stuff, you wouldn't believe it. You would think it was just like it was a mock or something.
Yeah, for sure. It is fascinating. I know some people have said like they don't use it, or I know some people have the mindset, and like I can rationalize this, but the mindset of like, hey, if you're using AI tools too much, then you're almost kind of skipping some of the learning, and it's like you're kind of making it a little bit dangerous for yourself. But the part of that I align with is like, especially as a new developer, if you're not taking any time to understand things, you'll probably find that you can get a lot of code put onto a screen. You can get stuff working, but it's almost like as soon as things don't work, now you're spending a lot more time like trying to figure out even how to ask Copilot. Like you basically would be saying, hey, Copilot, this code doesn't work. And like, that's not a great prompt. Like if you understand more about the code you have and sort of the results you're seeing, then you can write better prompts. But yeah, like I think if for folks that are using AI tools, you can certainly speed up a lot of development, but you don't want to trade away like this learning opportunity and understanding of what it's doing for you. So
yeah, you definitely need to understand what your code's doing. But yeah, it's I guess like if you go back quite a few years, people used to say the same about even IntelliSense. It's kind of like you shouldn't use IntelliSense because it's meaning you're not remembering the functions properly. And now your programmer couldn't live without IntelliSense. And it's the same kind of thing. It's just a new thing. So you've always got people saying, oh, you shouldn't be doing this because it's affecting learning. But yeah, totally. Like you can't just do the equivalent to what people say about Stack Overflow, copy paste, done. You've got to take that code, look at it, refactor it, and understand it and get it so you know it's bug free, you know it's what you actually want it to be, not what some AI has just dumped out.
Yeah, and one of the more recent conversations I had with someone about this very topic was like, is it a paradigm shift that we're going through? Because there's probably a lot of us with this exact mindset where we're saying you need to understand what you're doing before just copy pasting. I don't see that going away. Like I think you should understand things, but I think the depth at which you understand it, I'm starting to wonder if there's some of us that have been programming for a long time that are saying you need to have a deeper understanding, and there's going to be a new wave of developers coming through where they're like, no, I don't. And like they will be proving to us, I'm kind of speculating here, but they'll be proving to us that with a sort of more shallow understanding of some of the things being created, that they can be extremely effective. And that's because when they do have challenges, they still know how to prompt effectively to get answers. And it just basically their productivity overall is greater because they've used tools in a different way. So I'm very curious to see if that will happen, or like truly maintaining some deeper level of understanding that probably a lot of us that have been programming for years currently have. So be interesting.
I'm not even thinking like that much deeper level, like understanding what's going on under the hood. I'm more talking about just understanding the code that's right in front of you, where if it's kind of like dumping out a whole bunch of code, you copy it into your IDE, run it, it works, you've not even looked at the code, and then commit it, done, job done. Then that's what I'm talking about, where actually make sure that you've read that code. You don't need to understand how, you don't need to like disassemble into it and work out what's going on under the hood, but just looking at that code, is that how it should be? Has AI just misunderstood what I said and there's some like edge cases or something? But understanding what's in front of you, I think that will always be a thing. But yeah, as you say, it's hard to know, because in the future when AI is the point when it doesn't make these kind of mistakes and you're not going to spot things because it's so much better than the human mind, then we all become project managers effectively. And then when AI can do the jobs of project managers, what do we do then?
Yeah.
I guess I'm kind of like where a lot of people are nervous about what's going on with AI and jobs and things. I'm of the mindset that I'm only going to live so many decades longer.
Sure.
Whatever happens, AI and amazing technology innovations are going to happen in the future. I want to see it because I'm just excited about it. I want to see, regardless of what happens, I might lose my job and have to get something that's lower paid and have to get by. But the fact is, before I die, I want to see what comes out of this. And that's kind of my mentality, really. I want it to become as advanced as possible so I can see it before I move on.
Right. Yeah, no, and it's a fascinating thing to think about, right? Because I think it's easy, maybe not for everyone, but I think it's probably easy to lose sight of like how much technology progresses in our lifetime, right? So like I'm hoping I'm not at the end of my lifetime. And what I've seen so far already for technology changes is dramatic. But when you're living through it and like you're not doing a reflection of like, okay, like what did it look like when I was first using a computer? Like, okay, I had dial-up. I could never conceive being able to download a video game I just bought on the internet and having it on my computer gigabytes in like minutes. I would be sitting there for a month downloading something that I can't wait to play, and inevitably it would crash and I would lose it. So like just that alone is like this, for me, a huge technology shift. And obviously it's been decades, but you add all these little things up, the phones, right? Or like how much memory is in a phone? Like RAM even, right? Like, and I used to think my desktop computer, I remember getting a gigabyte of RAM and being like, this is insane. Like no one's ever going to have a gigabyte of RAM. And it's like, no, it's just, it's completely baffling. So I totally agree with you that like being able to kind of live our lives and seeing like what's going to happen with technology is very cool. The thing that I would add about the job part is like, I think there's a lot of people that are afraid like AI will take our jobs. And my framing for that is like, you don't need AI to take your job. AI is a big force and it's capable of doing that. But I think what gets your job taken is you not being willing to like evolve it. So if you never are trying to skill up and trying to see how things are changing, regardless of AI, you will inevitably become obsolete because things will change. And I think AI is just a big mover in that space. And I think if you're on top of it and you're seeing, okay, like trends are changing, I'm spending less time writing code this way, I'm spending more time like architecting things or trying to glue pieces together. Like it's just going to be a paradigm shift. And I think if you're kind of along for the ride, it's not so risky.
I think there's going to be an aspect of it because it's supply and demand, isn't it? So at the moment, developers are in high demand, so we can charge quite decent salaries. Whereas AI does a lot more stuff, there's going to be less demand because some of the work is being done by AI. So there's going to be less jobs and there's maybe salaries would go down. But one thing I like when I have this kind of conversation with people, one thing I always advise is network, because you kind of, if you're looking for work, you want lots of people to know of you and know you're looking for work and be able to just post out that you're looking for new work. You also want those people to be able to know you know what you're doing. So you need both of those things. You need to know what you're doing and you need lots of people to know that. And if you have that and if you can build your network and go to user groups, do different things and just meet different people and you know more people, then you're mitigating against being in a position where you don't have a job and you just can't find one.
Yeah. Totally agreed. And like one of the reasons I've been trying to do, like I mentioned earlier, that like I'm trying to do a lot of content creation because it truly makes me feel like fulfilled when I have, like there's a lot of people that, you know, they don't care, whatever, that's fine. Sometimes it feels kind of lonely creating content, but it only takes one person to be like, wow, that helped me so much. And it's like you have all of this momentum to be like, okay, it's all worth it. So that's one aspect of it. But the other part that, you know, related to what you said was like, I want to be in a position where it's not like a famous thing, like that's the wrong way to put it, but I want to be in a position where if someone were looking at content I was posting or sort of like my own personal brand is like, this person knows what they're talking about. And if they're a good fit for what we're doing, it's almost like they don't have to be concerned. Like they have confidence in like, okay, this person knows what they're talking about. We need this. Like it almost feels like a no-brainer versus like, oh, okay, like just another person. Like we have to go try to gauge all of this. I just want to position myself that people go, if we need this skill set, this person knows what's up. So
yeah, exactly. And they can, like yourself, there's lots of things online, videos, like podcasts and various things, your courses, which if you were looking for a job and someone wanted to hire you, they could look at those things. Where when I've been interviewing and I don't really know that much about the people that I'm about to interview, I don't mean about the podcast, I mean actually in work, because most people aren't in that position where I can go and look at the videos and stuff. So I don't know whether they know what they're talking about. So I'm very reliant on that thing. But if I could just search the name, find them, and I could see straight away they really know what they're talking about, then that's half of the story sold, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, back on refactoring, like that was one thing that in my time before Microsoft, it's kind of a funny thing to say out loud because it's weird, right? But I worked at a startup. I was writing a lot of the sort of original code. The founder of the company built the original product, but like that was a rewrite that we did. That's not an offense to him by any means. He would be the first person to say it needed to be rewritten. But so rewrites, and I had a team that the entire time I was there that was really responsible for rapidly prototyping new products. So I did that for 8 years. So what was interesting was that I built a lot of these original products that became the legacy code. So and this spread across teams because we would build the original foundation, get it working, get it kind of proven, and then product teams would form around it and we would move on to the next part. So by the end of my time there, it was like I would be jumping from team to team and they would be like, hey, we want to go build this thing. Like, can you explain this part of the code? Or, how would you go approach it? Because you obviously spent some time there. And for me, refactoring was just a huge part of what I was doing because not only did I have that experience across the code base, but I just feel like it's an underappreciated thing if people haven't been through startups. But I said this earlier in our conversation, but when you're trying to keep a company alive, there's a different set of trade-offs that you're making. It's not, is this the most prettiest code ever? It's, are we painting ourselves into a corner? If not, okay, can we get this out faster with confidence? And I feel like having these different constraints when you're framing it that way, that's one of the things that when I talk about refactoring and try to share content, I'm trying to share that aspect of my career because I don't think that a lot of people get that type of exposure to those constraints.
Yeah, definitely. I've worked in big companies and small companies. And yeah, I agree. Like with the small companies, it's such a faster learning curve. Well, that's probably the wrong way of putting it, but because you're wearing lots of different hats and not just a small cog. Yeah, it's quite an interesting. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to work in both types of companies.
Yeah, different. Like at Microsoft, it's completely different scale. Like things move slower for sure, but I understand why. Like there's more people involved because of the scale of even our software and our user base. There's like things we have to be more careful about. Like things are different just based on the scale. And where I was working before, like digital forensics was extremely important to get things accurate, right? If you had a date that you reported incorrectly and that was used in court, if someone was like, hey, look, this date is inaccurate and we can prove it, all of a sudden, all of that data that you collected that an investigator, an examiner used to make a case, they might say, well, throw it all out. Like, how can we trust the tools? Because clearly there's an error here. So if you can't explain it, like there goes your evidence, right? You can't use it effectively in court. So we had situations like this where it's extremely important to get right. So moving fast was important, but not at the expense of like inaccuracies. It could mean that the usability of the feature might not be perfect because users will understand, like, as long as I can get to the end result that I want to get to, or it's close, as long as the data's right, they're pretty happy. We can always optimize. And like at Microsoft, I find, given the scale that we're at, it's like, my team is currently like routing trillions of requests per day. Like we can't just be like, oops, there's a bug and like we're not routing anymore. Like that's slightly different impact, right? So just, I think, yeah, as you said, the perspective of these different types of organizations is really important to have.
Yeah. Don't make I'm blanking on the name, the big company that just took down
CrowdStrike.
CrowdStrike, that was it. So don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing to avoid.
Yeah, I suppose with your previous before Microsoft, where you were dealing with criminals and things, if a mistake like that, like as you say, like a date wrong, can cause the whole thing to be thrown out and that criminal go free, and then that criminal goes on to do something else, it's quite a scary responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like when we talk about the impact of that work, a lot of it's retroactive, right? Like unfortunately, something bad has happened. There's an investigation. They'll go seize devices, use our software on it. And the part that's proactive, though, is that if someone is truly guilty and you can help put them away, it means that you're potentially saving other people. The other thing, too, is like closure for victims. It's like, or people that are truly innocent. Like, it's really like, I can't remember the exact branding for the mission, but it's like, it's about uncovering the truth and building software that does that. So when your data is not accurate, like suddenly, like, where's your truth?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm aware we're quickly running out of time. One thing I did want to ask you, because like, obviously we've both done Don't Train courses, and I've had
Yes.
a few of the authors on now, and I always like to ask like, how you found that experience. I know with one thing for me was actually having the webcam on, generally in the bottom right hand corner whilst doing stuff. I found that quite weird because obviously, like
Sure.
we were talking about the audio editing before recording, and the fact that it's audio only, so I can chop, and you just can barely tell. But with video, you get the jump cuts and everything. So I was aware, oh, this is going to be quite tricky. How did you find it?
Yeah, no, so good question. I think for me, like the beginning of 2023 is like I started trying to do YouTube stuff, and it's funny in hindsight. Like I started trying to make YouTube videos, and I've told Nick Chapsis this directly, and it always sounds like a backhanded compliment, and I don't mean it that way. But I got to the point where I was watching his videos, and I was saying, like, I think I can do this. Like, if he's doing it, I can. And I don't, the part that sounds backhanded is I'm not trying to imply that I am just better than him. Like, that's not the message. It's that I think that he's doing something consistently. I think that was one of the things where I was like, look, he's putting out videos, he's educating. I'm like, I think I can educate. It doesn't mean better or worse. It's different than how other people will. But I think what I can do is be consistent. So I was like, I'm going to start doing this. So I started making YouTube videos. And the funny part in hindsight was that a few months in, he reached out to me. And I had like, I don't even know if I had like 1,000 subscribers, but he reached out to me and was like, hey, do you want to make Dome Train courses? And I just remember getting the message and being like, this is definitely like a phishing attempt. Like, this is not Nick Chapsis. So I just wanted to kind of give you that bit of story. But in terms of creating the videos and stuff, the Dome Train part wasn't unnatural because I was doing the YouTube videos. But even at that point in time, making YouTube videos was still kind of awkward for me because I've shared this publicly before, but like historically, I've always kind of described myself as like, oh, I'm afraid of public speaking. So with a camera, it's not like a million people sitting here, but it's still a camera and it's going to go on the internet. So it was, I felt very nervous and uncomfortable. And now at this point, like just from making YouTube videos and starting to do more live streaming, I don't want to say like I'm comfortable on camera because I think it's always a little bit of something where I'm like, oh crap, it's going to be recorded or it's live. Always a little bit uneasy about it. But at the same time, I think what I've overcome is like this negative self-talk of like, that was the thing that was totally limiting me. Like, oh, you're not good at it. Oh, you're afraid of it. I'm afraid of it because I'm not good at it. And I'm not good at it because I don't do it. And I don't do it because I'm afraid of it. Like, if you just cut the vicious cycle and say, I'm doing it, all of a sudden, it's not so bad.
Yeah, and as you say, consistency, the more you do it, the less it just becomes the normal. It's just what you do, isn't it, really?
Yeah. And I don't say that to be like, oh, I'm amazing at it now, but it's certainly more comfortable. And there's times where I'm like, if I have an idea for a YouTube video, as long as I've done a little bit of preparation with the code, like I don't script my videos. Like I don't read from anything. I prefer to naturally talk about it. I just have some key points I want to get across that I might jot down, but I originally was trying to script them. And I was like, this is counterproductive for me trying to be effective at making a video that feels good. So yeah, the consistency is like, it's just totally this key ingredient that I think a lot of people miss.
I found with mine, I script the intro, which is like just like 20, 30 seconds just to make that sound more seamless. But then when I go to actually share my screen and showing code and stuff, I think because I know what I want to demo, then I'm kind of like just what I'm doing is guiding what I'm saying. So I don't then need to script that. But I think that's because I've got, it's not up now, it's off to the side, but I've got a teleprompter for the videos. So I can put that in front of the camera and just for the intros though. But then when I turn them facing the screen, like I'm not, sorry, I'm aware I'm not looking at you right now because it's my camera's off to the side. My screen's in front. That's where the screen I'm sharing is. So I'm looking at this. So in the bottom left, it looks like I'm talking to the camera. Then I will go off and look at the screen, which when you're in the bottom right the corner, it looks like you're just turning and looking at the screen. So it's a bit more natural. Yeah,
it's been a good experience though. I feel very fortunate that kind of it had the opportunity early, and it's when I say this, I don't mean like from a financial perspective, but I feel like it was a life-changing experience to like get onto YouTube and then have this opportunity with Dome Train. Because, like, just to give you an example, because I'm not talking financially, but the fact that we're having this conversation right now, the very fact that we're able to do this, I interviewed Scott Hanselman 2 weeks ago or something. Like, these types of opportunities to talk with other people that are in the industry, I feel like if I hadn't started creating content and hadn't had some of these opportunities, I wouldn't have had these current opportunities. It's almost like this cascading, like luckiness that's happening. So yeah.
It's like a snowball effect. The snowball, as it rolls down the hill, it gathers more snow and then gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
I'm aware we're quickly running out of time. One thing I was going to ask, what are your thoughts on comments in code?
Oh, that's a good question. It's funny. I think I probably have an opinion and it doesn't even line up with what I personally do myself. So if I'm building my own software, like outside of work and stuff, there's comments everywhere, but they're mostly like, I'm just putting little markers in the code to say like, this is bad. And it's funny, it probably doesn't need a comment because the code is bad and it's pretty obvious, but it's almost like me recognizing to my future self, like, just so you know, you consciously wrote this thing and like, it's a fix me or a to do, like, hey, future self, I'm sorry, but here you go. So do I recommend people are doing that in their production code bases? Like maybe not, but I think if you're working in teams, I think the most important thing is that you're just aligning with your team about what your expectations are in your code base. So I think I would call that out. A lot of the advice that I would give in general is like, it's going to change. So like, think about the qualities and the characteristics of the things you're doing. And then if you're working in teams, try to align with people on it. I think comments in code are totally fine as long as what you're doing is not putting like, you're not putting the code into the comment, if that makes sense, because now you have two things to maintain. So abstractions of what the code is doing, explaining why, because sometimes you might read code and go, perfect example for refactoring. You come across it and you go, this is garbage. Like, let me go rewrite this. And now you've introduced the bug. And it's because someone wrote it a particular way that I'm not saying it had to be done that way, but they got it working and it doesn't look obvious. So that might not be good code, but it's functional, whatever. There's different arguments for doing it. Leaving a comment to say, like from that original author, like, hey, I played around with this and here's why this works this way. And fair warning, if you try the obvious path, it doesn't work because there's a bug in the SDK we're using, just making something up. Like that could save someone a lot of time in the future. So I think there's little things like that can be beneficial, but certainly saying something like, this if statement checks the variable. I'm like, well, yes, it does. Like, why? You don't need to comment that. So that's probably a bit of an exaggerated example, but I do see a place for it. But I think it's a team sort of alignment thing.
Yeah, I agree. And it goes back to, I think, anyone that says, this is the way, this is the only way, stop listening, because as in that, and some people say you should never have comments, your code should tell a story and everything. And yes, to a point, but there's also scenarios like you're describing where it's kind of a comment could save someone so much time just explaining why it was done this way, or if it's just, sometimes code is complex. You can try and abstract it into methods and stuff, and you should do, but sometimes just a little comment just explaining something can make it so much more readable and save someone a lot of time. So yeah, again, I completely agree. It depends.
Yeah, it depends, right? Like everything. But I love how you're framing, like if someone says like always or never do something, it's like stop listening. That's my philosophy is basically that. I don't think I've used that phrasing, but it's why like I personally, when I'm trying to share information, I'll often sit in the middle because I'm like, if I say always do this, it only takes one person to give one example where it doesn't work, and they've disproven what I've said, right? Because now it's like as an absolute, it's broken. But it's because the reality is there's always going to be some things that don't fit that perfectly. So I think if you understand why most of the time or rarely you should be doing things, that's the important part. And then just use your judgment because you're a software engineer, you're a smart person, do the right thing.
Yeah, just to clarify, when I say stop listening, that's kind of like, I'm kind of like an expression, as in, don't literally turn around and walk away.
Cover my ears, yeah.
Oh dear. Another thing I found quite a bit with readability is just the names of things, whether it's variables, functions, classes, whatever. So many code bases I look at, it's like, well, what does this thing do? And it could be just a different name would tell me straight away. And I don't think people put enough thought into what they call things, just thinking, when I'm writing this code, will this make sense to someone else or future me or whatever? Will I better look at this name and it's obvious? Or is it just called something because I couldn't be bothered thinking what to call it?
Yeah, or it makes sense in this context, but like if I were to zoom out a little bit in the code base that I'm in, like it's almost like it's getting lost in the noise. Like it needs a little bit more detail. Or the other way, sometimes the names are like overly detailed to the point where you're like, and you have so many small classes and things, you're like, there's a manager and a provider and a thing and another thing, and you're like, which like what are they actually doing? Like, because they're so specific that it's so specific, and there are so many similar things where it's like now you have this other mental gymnastics to go through. So naming's hard, but yeah, it's needs attention.
Yeah, like with the complexity, like my favorite acronym is KISS. Like keep it super simple. You've seen the comics where it shows, or not a comic, but like a, would you call it a comic if it's a single strip? But where it shows the graph and it's going up, and as developers get more experienced, a few years in, they're doing things like, all right, we're going to start abstracting this out, having all these different patterns and everything. And then as they get more experienced on the x-axis, when the graph drops down, and it's just keep it super simple, get like as little code as possible to do the job.
Yeah, it's almost like you get that little bit of experience and everything is like crazy levels of abstraction. Yeah, and then all of a sudden you become like the Yoda of programming, and you're like, no, back to super simple. So
I will definitely include that comic in the show notes. I think actually it was my comic pick for my last newsletter, I think.
Oh, nice.
Speaking of which, you've got a newsletter as well, haven't you?
Weekly I do have a newsletter, yes. Yeah.
So I will make sure, I'll make sure I include that. That's a weekly one, isn't it? Where
that is, yeah. And I initially started doing a lot of .NET stuff because a lot of my audience is very .NET heavy, but it's kind of funny. A lot of my content is .NET, but I feel like a lot of the value that I bring, I kind of said this earlier, is like, it's not just C# and .NET development. Like I have, as an engineering manager and someone that worked as an engineering manager and a software developer at the same time, I just feel like I have a different set of experiences that I want to share with people. Not to say that they're the right thing all the time, but to just give some perspective. So my newsletter, I have shifted to try and be more general software engineering. I will periodically dabble with, like, I want to do one that's going to be like building a web application from scratch in .NET. And I don't want that to hyper focus on like, expert level .NET developers. I want it to kind of feel like, hey, you're general in software engineering and you just want to see how this looks in C#. So it'll be basic stuff, but the newsletter is primarily just like general software engineering. The rest of my content is very heavy into C#.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I will include a link to subscribe to that in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you very much.
And I think my one's already in there anyway. It's on the side panel. So if you want to subscribe to mine, listeners, then there's a link there too. So I'm aware that you've got a hard stop very soon, so we'll wrap up. But yeah, well, I suppose before I say thank you, where is the best place if listeners do want to reach out to you?
Sure, yeah. If they want to get in contact with me, LinkedIn is probably the best. I am trying to be more active on X or Twitter, however you'd like to call it. So
don't call it X, please. Don't call it X.
Yeah, it doesn't feel good. Yeah, so if people want to get in touch, that's a good spot to do it. I would say my primary place for like creating content, if you just want to like consume the content, is going to be YouTube and LinkedIn. So I think those are probably the best two spots.
Awesome. Well, with that, just a massive thank you for joining me on the show. It's been awesome geeking out on refactoring and various other stuff. Like we're talking about naming before. I don't know what we're going to call this episode. Naming things is hard. Maybe we'll call it that.
Yeah, that sounds like a good name. Yeah. No, Dan, I wanted to say thank you. Like, this has been really cool for me to be able to jump on here and have this conversation with you. So we did cover a lot of ground, which is really cool. And I think all intermingled, intertwined, all related. So I think it's all valuable information.
Yeah, definitely. I love these episodes where it just goes off on tangents. We talk about different things because that's the fun. It's organic, isn't it?
Yeah, it's real, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. It's real, but then I'll edit it and then
then it's not so real. Yeah.
I don't remove content. It's just a bit more seamless. Cool. And thank you everyone else for listening. And a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter, X, at Dracan, which is Dracan. But the best place to get in touch with me is Discord, and the link to Discord is on the website, as well as the show notes, which will cover all the stuff we've mentioned today, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.